Bonney gaining Nika powers has been one of the most divisive moments in One Piece history, with some cheering it as a fittingly cathartic resolution to Bonney's storyline, and others feeling like the story is completely ruined now that another character is able to transform into Nika so easily. And for the record, I believe that this is a great idea in concept, and I have in fact been talking about how Bonney's story has been heading in this direction for some time now. But while I think Bonney becoming Nika just like Luffy is fitting for the ideas of the character and the story arc in general, and I certainly don't think that the story is ruined, I do feel that the path to getting here was missing a bit of groundwork that would have made me personally enjoy the moment more. See, I've seen people argue that Bonney becoming Nika is perfect because it makes sense thematically. After all, Bonney has always dreamed of Nika, Bonney dreams of freedom just like Luffy, Bonney has a fruit that allows her to use her imagination like Luffy, and Bonney's father was a slave who always believed in Nika and wanted to see his daughter freed. And yes, that's cool, it thematically fits, but here's the thing, themes don't mean much on their own. If next chapter, a new kid showed up who said, "I have always dreamed of Nika, I have always dreamed of freedom, I have a fruit that allows me to use my imagination, and my father was a slave who always believed in Nika and wanted me to have freedom," and then that kid turned into Nika at the end of the chapter, then guess what? Technically, this would be a thematically fitting conclusion to this kid's character storyline, but it would be terrible writing. Why? Because it happened too fast. Themes don't mean jack shit without the appropriate time, development, and groundwork in laying the foundation for those themes to be expressed. That is where the real discussion with Bonney lies. Not does it thematically fit, not does it make sense that her fruit can do this, not is she too powerful, not should there only be one Nika. All of that is fair on paper. The real question is, has Bonney become too significant and special in the story too fast? To understand what I mean, there is an important principle in storytelling that needs to be laid out. See, in storytelling, there is an underlying balance when it comes to incorporating new characters into the story, which is that if you suddenly elevate a new character to an extreme level of status or significance in the story, where they seem to quote-unquote steal the spotlight, then this generally needs to come with a proportionate degree of writing, development, and character focus beforehand, in order for the character's newfound significance to feel natural. An easy example in One Piece is how readers feel about Law versus how they feel about Kid. It may take a moment to see how this pertains to Bonney, but stick with me here. So in Wano, both Law and Kid were given an extremely exalted status and relevance in the story. They were Luffy's quote-unquote rivals throughout the Wano arc, they got to take down the second biggest villain of the arc, they got a tremendous amount of screen time, they shared the penultimate battle of the arc, they were even given equal bounties to Luffy in the end. Law and Kid were basically given major starring roles in the Wano War, arguably playing a bigger role than every other character besides Luffy. Yet most readers hated Kid in Wano, but loved Law. Why is that? Well, the simple difference is that Oda actually took a lot of time developing Law as a character for us first, slowly crafting a story around him, making the reader slowly grow attached to him, gradually building Law up as a main character, as important as the Straw Hats, such that as the story went on, we became more comfortable seeing Law in the spotlight, with Law being side by side with Luffy for Doflamingo's defeat, with Law fighting side by side with Luffy again on the rooftop in Wano, with Law even getting to defeat a Yonko, Law getting the same level of credit as Luffy after Wano, and so on. Law is the perfect example of a former side character who was then promoted to an extremely significant level of status, spotlight, power, and relevance in the story, to the point that he often can even overshadow the Straw Hats and other characters. However, readers have generally been okay with that and really liked Law, because Oda did his due diligence in taking his time developing Law and endearing Law to the reader. On the other hand, with Kid, it's the total opposite. Oda basically skipped a lot of the actual writing and development around Kid, and just took this rarely seen side character and thrust him into a starring role in Wano's climax. Kid just gets to be in the spotlight for the finale of this 300 chapter long conflict alongside Luffy, Zoro, and Law, despite Kid barely being involved in the story at all beforehand. And in fact, Kid of all people gets to be the one to actually finish off one of the Yonko, and then get equal credit with Luffy and Law. I don't think a lot of readers cared for Kid getting so much spotlight in the Onigashima battle, because we never spent that much time with him as a character in the first place, and yet here he is, front and center at the climax of this gigantic conflict that the entire post-timeskip has been building to, and Kid is for some reason reason playing a bigger role than the vast majority of other established characters. So you see the difference? It's pretty simple. If you're giving a character a really exalted role, making them the star of the show in a sense, giving them an elevated level of status and significance in the narrative, often to the point that other previously established main characters are overshadowed, then readers and audiences are just going to accept it much better when it feels like the character has a corresponding level of writing and development, building them gradually into the story beforehand. So how does all of that apply to Bonney? Well, to begin with, let me make it very clear that I am not saying that Bonney does not have some good writing behind her, or that Oda hasn't spent some time building her into the story. Bonney is nowhere near as bad as the example I used earlier of Captain Kidd. That was just a particularly extreme example to explain the general principle I'm getting at of this balance in storytelling. But keeping that principle in mind, looking at Bonney, the question is about whether this balance of Bonney's newfound significance and how special she has become in the narrative is proportional to how much character groundwork Oda has actually put in for her character. And this is where I feel we could have used some more groundwork and time with Bonney. Because no matter how you spin it, Bonney has become an extremely special and important character in the narrative really fast. Like in a way that is simply unprecedented in One Piece. To understand what I mean, let's take a step back. To begin with, when Bonney was first proposed to join the crew, that came with her being immediately established as one of the most important characters in the entire world, practically a key weapon of mass destruction, because Bonney is the only person who can commandeer control over the government's ultimate weapons, the pacifistas. The pacifistas are basically the world government's absolute elite army of soldiers, with each individual pacifista being stronger than the entire pre-timeskip Straw Hat crew, and each pacifista being as valuable as an entire battleship. They are so valuable that the Gorosei prioritized immediately securing all of them when they arrived on Egghead. So to begin with, the fact that this power to control this ultimate army of destruction and turn them against the world government was a role given to Bonney made her, as a child, immediately made her one of the most powerful and important people on the planet, and an absolutely game-breaking factor in the final war, with the potential to play a practically identical role to what Tama did in the Wano War, in that just as Tama flipped the entire flow of the Wano War by taking control over the elite soldiers, the Gifters, so too is Bonney set to be able to do that very same thing on a far more significant scale in the final war, by being able to take control over the giant army of the world government's most valuable elite soldiers, the Pacifista. This unique role alone made Vegapunk believe that Bonney was incomparably valuable and now a must-have target of the world government, such that Bonney had to now be protected by a Yonko crew. So essentially, right off the bat, Bonney was placed in the same sort of unique tier of extreme value as Nico Robin, in that Bonney alone has an ability that can potentially change the future of the entire world. So that in itself makes Bonney a very special character, even as a Straw Hat, as a future decisive factor in the final war. However, beyond that, now Bonney also has another extraordinarily rare and unique ability, which is to turn into Nika. This again is insanely special, but in a completely different way, in that Nika is very literally the embodiment of the legend that heralds the dawn of the world, the same being that all these races, the Giants, the Buccaneers, the Lunarians, and so on, have been waiting on for centuries, and the fact that Luffy was the first one to awaken as Nika after 800 years is what made Luffy the new Joy Boy that the world had been waiting on as well. This long build-up to the awakening of Luffy as Nika was framed as a once-in-a-millennium moment, literally the second coming of the Messiah. So the fact that after all that, we meet Bonney and it turns out that she can also actually turn into Nika on a whim as well, is, well, insanely special actually seems like a severe understatement at this point. And now on top of that, turning into Nika, while extraordinarily momentous and legendary in and of itself, well, this is actually just one of Bonney's abilities, as it seems as though she has the potential to turn into a version of any future that she imagines, which means that even though Luffy's Nika fruit initially seemed to be the most unbound and free fruit ever, befitting Luffy as the representation of freedom that we have followed for so long, well, now Bonney's fruit actually seemingly replaces that as an even more unbound and free fruit, with even more limitless imaginative potential. So symbolically, what Bonney now represents is extremely unprecedentedly significant as well. And finally, as I've talked about in the past, Bonney also seems very likely to be the next Straw Hat to join the crew, but she seems set up to be not just any Straw Hat, rather she is written as the Straw Hat that is most similar to Luffy, practically a miniature version of him. As I break down in this video, Bonney carries many of the same mannerisms, personality traits, and desires as Luffy. She was essentially written to be a younger version of Luffy, with the only difference being that Bonney's more hot-headed than Luffy was as a child. But aside from that, she's like a little Luffy. And not only does Bonney seem set up to perfectly fit into that apprentice role on the ship, as the protege to the Pirate King, the Shanks to Luffy's Roger if you will, we can literally already see Luffy teaching Bonney and guiding her in the climax of the Egghead arc. So if you combine all of these factors together, Bonney is, well, there's no other way to phrase it than she's a very, 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 very special character. Even by the Straw Hat standards, Bonney seems to be extremely special compared to the rest of the crew, in literally every regard. Her incredible Nico Robin level world-changing potential as the controller of all the weapons of mass destruction, the pacifistas, and the symbolic significance of Bonney being the second person in 800 years to awaken as the legendary Nika, and the limitless potential of Bonney's fruit that seemingly surpasses all other devil fruits that we've ever seen, and Bonney's unique role among the crew as seemingly the spiritual successor to the captain. That is a lot of specialness packed into one character, no matter how you spin it. I mean, Brook's been around for 600 chapters and he's never even gotten a fight. But here's the thing. Some characters are naturally going to be more important than others. As I said before, usually how okay this feels for readers is going to be relative to how much character writing these more important characters get to go along with them getting more of the spotlight. In a vacuum, I really don't think it's a problem that Oda is doing so much for Bonney and introducing this new character who is so significant. In fact, of course, if there is a character who is supposed to be the apprentice to Luffy, who is supposed to be the Shanks to Luffy's Roger, then of course that character should feel extra special. However, in that case, I think the one thing I do feel is fair to say is that we could have really just used some more time with Bonney before getting to this point. That's really all it is to me. Because essentially, while Bonney is being established as an extraordinarily special and significant Straw Hat with a comparatively elevated role in the narrative from here on, at the same time she also didn't get quite as much character focus and storytelling as the rest of the Straw Hats did when they were being introduced and turned into main characters. Yes, the Egghead arc in general has been a very long arc in terms of chapter count, but the reality is that Egghead had a lot of characters and a lot of side plots, and generally a lot of things going on. Bonney really wasn't the focus for most of Egghead. She was one of many characters who were present and she had a running storyline in the background, but it was never really a primary focus amongst everything else that was going on for the majority of the arc. I mean, half the time we haven't even been at Egghead, we've been away at other outside world events. If you compare this to most other Straw Hats origin stories, usually we get an intensely character-focused storyline with the Straw Hat front and center, to really get to know them, flesh them out, and develop them, like Nami in Arlong Park, or Chopper in Drum Kingdom, Sanji at Baratier, and so on. Even for extremely significant characters who didn't stay on the ship but still reached main character status, you see similar levels of writing, focus, and development, such as for Vivi in Alabasta, or Law across Punk Hazard and Dressrosa, or Momonosuke across Punk Hazard and Wano. There's just a tremendous amount of time and focus and development that we get for these characters, as Oda slowly eases them into extremely significant, elevated roles of importance in the series. Bonney in Egghead has just been comparatively much lighter focus and writing. She was just not the main focus for most of Egghead until Saturn showed up. And even that would be okay if Oda could just make up for that with a really intensive backstory for her, and this is where I feel we missed some significant potential. Because in my opinion, the problem is that the backstory we got, while phenomenal, was mainly Kuma's backstory. Throughout the entire Kuma backstory, there is actually one and only one chapter that is from Bonney's point of view. Aside from that, Bonney is not the focal point of the backstory either. The pivotal dramatic centerpiece of this arc was Kuma's backstory, and Bonney's character storyline was kind of treated as the companion piece to Kuma's, when really it needed to be more of a 50-50 split, since Bonney is the one that we need to be more attached to and become more invested in if Oda is about to reveal her as another Nika. So overall, the Egghead arc itself doesn't truly give us much focus on Bonney's character for the majority of the arc, and then the backstory we got also isn't really Bonney's backstory at all, it's more so her father's. So it's a tricky situation, because while Bonney has more character writing than a run-of-the-mill minor side character, considering Bonney's being written into the story as this major character, literally Nika number 2, literally the protagonist's successor, well, by that lofty standard, I feel that the actual storytelling time that we got to set up Bonney for this role was actually really brief if you were to string it all together. Essentially, Bonney's level of significance and spotlight and power and role and general specialness has all come together extraordinarily fast in a way that can't really be compared to any previous One Piece character. I do believe the speed of it all is the biggest factor when it comes to some hesitance from some readers towards Bonney, as I think a lot of readers would have been open to the idea of Luffy getting a protege who begins to follow in his footsteps, who eventually begins to emulate Luffy and finally even transforms into Nika just like Luffy. I think all readers would have loved that if that dynamic had been developed a lot slower and we spent more time with this new character and felt more ready to accept them coming into their own as the spiritual successor to the hero. Bonney has simply been thrust into that role very quickly. Hell, if Bonney's arc was handled with the same level of time and development as, say, Momonosuke, then I imagine there would be no division and all readers would be universally welcoming this moment of Bonney becoming Nika just like Luffy. But all of that is to say that I'm not saying Bonney isn't a well-written character. I think she's a good character. I think it's easy to resonate with her story, and the concept behind the character certainly makes her sympathetic. I do like her character decently enough, and I personally do like the concept of a successor to Luffy in general. After all, this whole story of One Piece started with the simple idea of a hat being passed down from one generation to the next to the next. So seeing Luffy at this stage coming into his own as Pirate King, just as a wide-eyed young apprentice now learns from watching Luffy, thereby carrying on the cycle, well, it's perfect for this phase of the story in my opinion. All in all, I enjoy this development. Literally the only thing I'm saying I would have liked in retrospect is if we are getting another Nika, if we are getting a protege for Luffy, then spending more time focusing in on and developing this character as more than just a companion piece for their parent would have been appreciated, and would have made me much more excited when this moment happened where we get another Nika to go alongside Luffy. But let me know how you feel about Bonney's new role in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video then definitely like and subscribe.